They speak with certainty. They explain things they barely understand. No expertise, no evidence, no reasoning, just confidence. And when they're wrong, which they often are, they double down, raise their voice, and call you arrogant for disagreeing. If you've ever found yourself wondering why the most ignorant people tend to be the most confident, you're not alone. It's not just annoying, it's dangerous. Because in almost every system of power, from politics to social media to the workplace, confidence is often mistaken for competence. And that mistake is costing us more than we realize. But here's the unsettling part. This isn't a modern issue. It didn't begin with influencers or comment sections. Long before the internet gave everyone a microphone, this pattern had already been observed, quietly, bitterly, by one of the most pessimistic minds in philosophy, Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer didn't need peer-reviewed psychology to recognize the problem. He saw it firsthand. Well before experiments, charts, or academic labels, he noticed a pattern in human behavior that still explains why confidence so often rises where understanding falls. He wrote, "Ignorance is degrading only when it is found in company with riches." But that's not quite the whole picture, because in his view, ignorance becomes something far worse when it's combined not with wealth, but with certainty. He argued that people tend to form opinions quickly and irrationally, then cling to them like anchors, not because the opinions are well formed, but because they are theirs. And to change one's mind, he said, would require not just humility, but the capacity to even detect that something might be wrong. Most people never reach that point. Centuries later, psychology gave Schopenhauer's observation a name, the Dunning-Kruger Effect. In 1999, David Dunning and Justin Kruger conducted a series of studies that revealed something counterintuitive and deeply disturbing. Participants were asked to complete tests on logic, grammar, and humor. Then, they were asked to assess how well they thought they had done. The results were clear. The people who performed the worst consistently rated themselves among the best. They were not just incompetent, they were unaware of their own incompetence. This wasn't simply a matter of overconfidence. It was a structural blind spot. The very skills required to accurately judge their own performance were the same ones they lacked. In other words, they didn't know enough to know they didn't know enough. At the same time, those who actually performed well often underestimated themselves. Because when you understand something deeply, you become painfully aware of its complexity. You stop seeing answers and start seeing layers. You begin to realize just how many ways something could go wrong. And here lies the paradox. The more you know, the more uncertain you become. Not because you're unsure of the truth, but because you're acutely aware of how much truth there is to know. This makes confidence a terrible compass for truth. Yet culturally, we continue to reward it. We hire the confident candidate, even if they're bluffing. We follow the loudest voice in the room, even if they're wrong. We mistake certainty for leadership and doubt for weakness. But doubt, real, intellectual humility, is often the clearest sign that someone knows what they're talking about. Schopenhauer had a bleak view of the average person's ability to reason. He believed most people didn't think. They simply felt, then justified those feelings with post hoc logic. Once an idea settled into their mind, it would harden, immune to evidence, insulated by ego. This is why, in his view, true discourse was rare. Because in most conversations, people aren't searching for truth. They're searching for confirmation. They don't want to be corrected. They want to win. And the people most likely to win these battles? Often the least qualified. Not because they have the best arguments, but because they don't feel the burden of doubt. They speak in absolutes. They interrupt. They posture. And to the untrained ear, that sounds like authority. The result? Entire systems, academic, corporate, political, become distorted by the illusion of knowledge. Those who know the least rise the fastest. Those who know the most become invisible. This isn't just theoretical. Look at how misinformation spreads. Studies on social media behavior have shown that false information spreads more rapidly than true information because it's simpler, more emotionally charged, and more confidently presented. Reality is messy. Truth is complex. But lies can be clean, bold, and assertive. They can be packaged neatly into headlines, shouted through microphones, or plastered across screens. And once they're out there, they're hard to erase because correcting them requires a level of nuance that the average audience doesn't reward. Even Plato in The Republic warned about this dynamic. He described how the masses are drawn not to those who seek wisdom, but to those who flatter and entertain. The philosopher, the one who questions, doubts, analyzes, is seen as irrelevant, even dangerous. Meanwhile, the demagogue rises, promising certainty in an uncertain world. Plato feared that this would lead to the erosion of truth itself, and that fear wasn't abstract. It was a recognition that truth is fragile when it competes with confidence. But what makes this all worse is that the Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't just apply to individuals. It applies to entire societies. When cultures reward certainty over thoughtfulness, performance over accuracy, and charisma over competence, the consequences scale. Bad ideas don't just persist, they thrive. They become dogma. They get repeated, amplified, normalized. Eventually, they start shaping policy, education, law, public health. And by the time the damage is visible, it's too late to point fingers, because the people who knew better were never listened to in the first place. There's an old saying that when the wise point at the moon, the fool looks at the finger. But in today's world, the fool doesn't just look at the finger. They start a podcast explaining why the moon doesn't exist. And they'll say it with such confidence, such certainty, that millions will listen. Some will believe, and a few, desperate for clarity in a chaotic world, will follow them off a cliff. This isn't an exaggeration. We've seen it in the collapse of civilizations, in the rise of tyrants, in the way every authoritarian regime begins with a flood of false certainties, delivered loudly, proudly, and without apology. It's easy to blame the audience for falling for it. But the real question is, why does this keep happening? Why, despite all our knowledge, all our progress, all our access to information, do we still fall for the confident idiot? Schopenhauer might argue that it's because we don't really value truth. We value simplicity. We value ease. And most of all, we value the feeling of being right. The confident fool gives us that feeling. They speak in a way that leaves no room for doubt. And in a world filled with complexity, doubt is exhausting. So we choose the illusion, not because it's true, but because it's easier. That choice, Schopenhauer believed, is what separates the thinker from the herd. The thinker sees the complexity. They endure the discomfort of doubt. They ask questions no one wants to ask. And for that, they are often dismissed, ridiculed, or ignored. But that discomfort is essential, because without it, there is no growth, no truth, no real understanding. And yet, our world continues to elevate the opposite. Simplicity, certainty, confidence without depth. The louder the voice, the more attention it gets. The more attention it gets, the more influence it gains. And slowly the truth is drowned out, not by lies, but by noise. Psychologist Adam Grant once said that confidence is a measure of how much you believe in yourself. Competence is a measure of how much you know, and they're often inversely related. But Schopenhauer came to a more ruthless conclusion. He didn't think this was just a cognitive quirk. He thought it was baked into the structure of the human mind, that people prefer illusions because the alternative demands too much. He observed that the average person doesn't pursue truth because they lack the capacity or the desire to confront their own errors. And those who do pursue it, they're often forced to live on the margins, isolated, misunderstood, not because they're wrong, but because they refuse to play the confidence game. This divide isn't just intellectual, it's emotional, because the confident fool isn't just selling a belief, they're selling relief. Relief from uncertainty, from doubt, from the exhausting task of thinking things through. And the audience, hungry for certainty, buys it. This is why conspiracy theories thrive. They offer a sense of control in a world that feels chaotic. They present complex global issues as if they're all caused by a single hidden force. They simplify, distort, and repackage reality into a narrative that feels manageable. And those who lack the tools to critically evaluate them, those caught in the grip of Dunning-Kruger, become their most loyal defenders. Incompetence, when paired with certainty, becomes infectious. And once it takes root, it doesn't just mislead, it multiplies. The person who knows little teaches others what they think they know. Their confidence is mistaken for wisdom. Their audience repeats it, and suddenly, falsehood spreads faster than the truth ever could. That's why the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't a harmless curiosity. It's a self-replicating pattern, a cognitive pyramid scheme. And by the time it's recognized, the damage has already been done. Think about how this plays out in your own life. You've probably seen someone in a position of influence, on social media, at work, maybe even in your friend group, who consistently speaks on topics they barely understand. And yet people trust them, they quote them, they follow their advice. Meanwhile, someone else, more thoughtful, more informed, hesitates to speak up, not because they don't know, but because they know enough to doubt. They're aware of the nuances. They're aware of how easily they could be misunderstood. So they stay quiet, and the void is filled by noise. That's not a fluke. That's the mechanism. Even in academia, this imbalance plays out. A 2012 study from Cornell showed that individuals who are overconfident in their answers are more likely to be viewed as competent by their peers, regardless of whether their answers are correct. And this has implications far beyond psychology. It influences who we vote for, who we trust in crises, and who gets to shape the public narrative. The irony? The more power the overconfident gain, the less incentive they have to improve. They don't need to learn. They're already being rewarded. Their confidence becomes a shield against correction, and the cycle deepens. Schopenhauer predicted this erosion of intellectual integrity. He saw that reason alone was not enough to guide human behavior. Passion, ego, and social validation often overpowered logic, and he feared that as societies became more democratic, the voice of the ignorant would carry as much weight as the voice of the wise, not because it was right, but because it was louder. He wrote, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone. In crowds, he must relinquish his independence." This wasn't just about solitude. It was about truth, about how easily it's lost in the noise of collective delusion. But Schopenhauer wasn't the only one who saw it. Friedrich Nietzsche, who admired Schopenhauer in his early years, would later expand on this theme. He argued that the herd morality of society discouraged independent thought, that those who saw things differently were often shamed, labeled dangerous, or pushed aside, and that the greatest thinkers often suffered not because they were wrong, but because they were unwilling to conform to the crowd's illusion of certainty. Nietzsche once said, "Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. A lie can be corrected, but a conviction, a belief held with blind certainty, becomes immune to evidence." And this brings us full circle, because the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just a psychological glitch, it's a societal vulnerability, one that manipulative systems, political, religious, economic, have exploited for centuries. A confident voice with the wrong information can sway millions. An uncertain voice with the right information is often ignored. And if truth is determined by volume rather than validity, then the future belongs not to the wise, but to the loudest. So what can be done? Schopenhauer would say, very little. He believed that most people are governed by their impulses, not their intellect. That philosophy and reason will always remain the domain of a rare few. It's a grim view, but one that, disturbingly, continues to be validated. But maybe there's another way to look at it. Understanding this dynamic doesn't make you immune to it, but it gives you a lens, a way to recognize when confidence is being used as a mask, when certainty is being used as a weapon, when the person speaking isn't interested in truth, only in winning. That awareness is powerful because it forces you to pause, to think, to resist the instinct to follow the loudest voice in the room. It also reveals something uncomfortable about yourself. Because the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just about them, it's about us. All of us are susceptible, in different domains, at different times, and the moment you think you're above it, you've already stepped into its trap. The only real antidote is humility, intellectual humility, the willingness to say, "I don't know," to ask more questions than you answer, to seek understanding instead of control. That's not weakness, that's strength, but it rarely gets rewarded because we live in a culture that celebrates speed over depth, simplicity over nuance, certainty over doubt, a culture that teaches us to perform rather than understand. And yet, buried beneath all that noise, there are still people who think deeply, who ask hard questions, who remain curious. They may be quiet, they may be ignored, but they're there. And the irony is, those are often the people you should be listening to. Not the loudest, not the most certain, but the ones who understand just how complex the world really is and speak carefully because of it. They're not trying to impress you, they're trying not to mislead you. And in a world that increasingly rewards the opposite, that might be the rarest kind of honesty there is.